The wind moved through the trees in a slow, steady hum, bending branches and shaking the leaves in a way that made everything feel alive. I had been walking for hours, my boots pressing into the damp soil, the weight of my pack settling deep into my shoulders. The air smelled of pine and earth, thick with the scent of wet moss and decaying leaves. I wasn't lost. At least I didn't think I was. But the deeper I went, the less certain I became. I had come out here alone just like I always did. The woods had been my escape for years, a place where I could shut out the noise of the world and just exist. I liked the isolation, the quiet, the feeling of being completely untethered. I had packed enough supplies for 3 days: water, protein bars, a small tent, and my hunting knife. I knew how to handle myself, but something about this trip felt different. I first noticed it when I set up camp on the first night. The silence. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet, the peaceful, rhythmic sounds of the forest settling into night. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like something had pressed a hand over the mouth of the world and told it to keep still.
No crickets.
No rustling leaves, just a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed in from all sides. I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things. I had been hiking all day, exhausted, dehydrated. Maybe I was just tired. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and forced myself to eat even though my stomach felt tight and uneasy. As the fire crackled, I listened for any sign of life, anything at all. A branch snapping, an owl calling, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing. I hardly slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching. I kept my knife close, my fingers curled around the hilt, but I didn't hear anything. Still, the feeling never left. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had been alone in the woods countless times before, and nothing had ever happened. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't leave. I decided to cut my trip short. I would hike back the way I came and be home by nightfall. I walked fast, barely stopping to drink water, my legs burning with every step. But the deeper I went, the more the landscape seemed wrong. The trees felt unfamiliar. The path I had taken the day before was gone, replaced by thick underbrush and tangled roots. I pulled out my map, my compass. I should have been heading south, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. Panic crept in at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it down. I had enough experience to know that fear made people stupid. I needed to stay calm. I picked a direction and walked. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky. My legs ached, my throat dry from breathing heavy. I should have seen something by now. A landmark, a familiar tree, the stream I had crossed the day before. But there was nothing, just trees, endless, unbroken trees. As the sun began to set, I realized I had no choice but to stop. My body was screaming for rest, and stumbling around in the dark would only make things worse. I set up camp in a small clearing, my hands shaking as I lit my fire. The silence was still there, pressing in from all sides. I sat with my back against a tree, watching the fire crackle, my knife in my lap. I needed to think. I had to retrace my steps, find where I had gone wrong. Maybe I had veered off the trail without realizing it. Maybe I was closer to civilization than I thought. I just had to keep moving. The fire burned low. I added more wood, but the flames didn't seem to want to grow. The light barely reached the edges of the clearing. I could feel the darkness beyond it, thick and heavy, pressing in like a living thing. Then I heard it, a sound, a low, deliberate scrape against bark. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, slow and steady, like something was dragging its claws along a tree trunk. It was close, too close. My grip tightened on the knife, I didn't move, didn't breathe. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the trees. Then silence. I stayed awake all night, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Every time my eyes fluttered shut, I heard it again. A step, a branch creaking, the sound of something shifting just beyond my sight. By morning, my hands were numb from gripping the knife. My muscles ached from staying rigid for hours. I needed to move. I needed to find my way out. I packed quickly and started walking, my body running on pure adrenaline. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to go. The trees stretched on forever, the landscape shifting and changing until I wasn't sure if I was walking in circles. Then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Fresh, deep, too large to be a boot. The shape was wrong, the edges too sharp. My stomach dropped. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, my pack bouncing against my back. My lungs burned, my legs screaming with every step. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, forcing my way through the trees, tearing through the underbrush until the world around me blurred. Then suddenly the trees broke open. I stumbled into a clearing, my knees hitting the dirt hard. And there, at the edge of the trees, was a road. A road. I scrambled forward, barely able to breathe. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. My head spun. I followed the road blindly, my body running on empty, until I saw the first sign of life. A small cabin in the distance. I don't remember how I got there. One moment I was walking, the next I was pounding on the door, my voice hoarse from screaming for help. An old man answered, his face twisted in shock as he looked at me, covered in dirt and sweat, my eyes wild with fear. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled me inside and locked the door behind me. I sat at his table, shaking, as he poured me water and asked me what had happened. I couldn't answer, because I didn't know. All I knew was that something had been in those woods with me, watching, waiting, and whatever it was, it hadn't wanted me to leave. I never should have gone alone. That thought circled my head as I stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by towering trees and the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but full, like something is listening. I had planned this trip for months, excited for the solitude, the fresh air, the chance to clear my head away from the world. But now, as the light faded and the trees cast long, shifting shadows, I felt something else entirely. I had hiked in deep, far beyond the well-marked trails, following a narrow deer path that led me deeper and deeper into the wilderness. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food for days, extra clothes, a sturdy knife, a compass, and my GPS. I was prepared, or at least I thought I was. But preparation doesn't mean much when the land itself seems against you. The first sign that something was wrong came when I lost track of time. I had been moving for what felt like a few hours, but when I checked my watch, it was much later than expected. The sun hung lower than it should have, the light filtering through the canopy in eerie, golden streaks. I brushed it off, thinking I had just misjudged my pace, but the unease in my stomach lingered. Then, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. A pile of bones, picked clean, stacked neatly at the base of a tree. Not scattered, not chewed, but arranged. A crude symbol carved into the bark beside it. I stopped to examine it, feeling a chill run down my spine. Could have been a hunter, I told myself. Maybe someone marking their territory. But something about the bones, the way they were placed, felt off. The deeper I went, the more I saw. Trees stripped of their bark in jagged, erratic patterns. Rocks piled into unnatural formations, stacked like crude towers. And always the feeling that I was being watched. Not by a person, Not in the way a lost hiker might stumble upon a stranger's camp, but something else, something patient. I told myself I was imagining it. I had been alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. But that night, as I set up camp and built a fire, I heard it. A sound in the distance, faint, almost like breathing. Not an animal, not the wind, but something measured, controlled. It stopped the moment I noticed it. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I jolted awake, sure I had heard something moving outside my tent. I told myself it was nothing, just the sounds of the forest. But in the morning, I found footprints around my camp. Not boot prints, not barefoot, something in between. The ground was disturbed in a way I couldn't explain, like something had been there but didn't want to leave a clear mark. I should have left then, packed up and hiked back the way I came. But stubbornness kept me going. I had come here to prove something to myself, to push my limits. So I moved deeper, breaking every rule of the wilderness. I ignored the fear, ignored the signs. The second night was worse. The noises returned, closer now. My fire, which had been burning strong, suddenly died as if smothered. I relit it with shaking hands, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But I stayed, and then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, just the shape of something, just at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move like it belonged there. It didn't move like anything I'd ever seen. It didn't run, didn't lunge. It just watched. And when I reached for my knife, it stepped back, fading into the dark. I don't remember sleeping. I must have, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. My fire was out again, my gear untouched, but the feeling remained. I was being hunted. I didn't take my time packing up. I didn't eat. I just started moving fast, retracing my steps back toward where I had come from. But the forest wasn't the same. The landmarks I had passed weren't there. My GPS, which had been working fine, now refused to connect. And the deeper I moved, the more I realized I wasn't going back the way I came. By the fourth day, I knew I was in trouble. My food was running low, my water almost gone. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or the exhaustion. It was the quiet. The forest, once full of birds, insects, rustling leaves, was silent, dead silent. The only sound was my own breath, my own footsteps, and something else. Something that followed just far enough behind that I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I started running. It didn't matter where, I just needed to move. The trees blurred past me, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. But no matter how far I ran, it was always there, waiting, watching. And then I saw it, a cabin, old, half-collapsed, but real. I sprinted toward it, throwing myself inside and barricading the door behind me. The air was stale, the walls covered in deep scratches. Someone had been here before, someone who hadn't made it out. Night came, and with it the sound, the breathing, closer now, just outside. I gripped my knife, knowing it wouldn't matter. I could see the door shifting, something pressing against it, testing the wood. Then, nothing. The silence stretched on, unbearable. And then light. Morning. The door was still intact, my pack untouched. But I wasn't alone. There, on the floor, was something that hadn't been there before. My own footprints. Vit. Leading from the door to where I had slept. I didn't waste a second. I ran. I don't remember how long. Hours. Days. I just ran. And when I finally stumbled out onto a road, lungs burning, body broken, I collapsed. A passing car stopped. Someone helped me up, asked me if I was okay. I couldn't speak, couldn't explain, because how do you explain something you don't understand? I never went back. I don't go into the woods anymore. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear it. The breathing, just outside my window. I don't know if I should be writing this. Maybe it's better if I just try to forget. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I'm right back there in those woods, feeling the cold sweat on my skin, hearing my own breath shaking in the quiet. So maybe writing it down will help. Maybe it will make it less real. I don't even remember exactly when the idea first came to me. I'd been looking for something, some kind of escape, and I thought a solo backpacking trip would be good. Just me, my pack, and the forest. No people. No noise. Just quiet. I picked a remote spot up in the northern woods, miles away from any town. It was a little-used trail, barely even a trail at all. That's what I wanted. The drive took most of the day. The last hour was on a dirt road full of potholes, and when I finally pulled over at the trailhead, I was already feeling the weight of being so far from civilization. No cars, no signs of people, just thick trees and the trail stretching out in front of me. The first day was fine. I hiked deep into the woods, deeper than I probably should have, but I was enjoying the solitude. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a ceiling over me, blocking out most of the sky. I made good progress, covering about 10 miles before setting up camp near a small creek. As I lay in my tent that night, listening to the water trickle over rocks, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. That feeling didn't last. The next morning, the air felt different, heavier, the kind of feeling you get before a storm, even though the sky was clear. I packed up and kept moving, but the woods felt quieter than before. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I hiked another 8 or 9 miles before stopping in a small clearing. The plan was to camp there for the night, but something felt off. The trees here were different, thicker, their bark rough and split open in places, like they were wounded. The air smelled wrong, like damp rot. I told myself I was imagining things. I set up my tent, ate, and tried to shake the feeling. Then, as I was getting ready to turn in, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. It was a boot print, fresh, not mine. I stared at it for a long time, my heart beating too fast. I hadn't seen another person in 2 days. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The print was large, deep, from a heavy boot, the kind made for serious hiking. And it was heading in the direction I had just come from, like someone had been following my trail. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe it was old. Maybe I just missed it earlier. But I barely slept that night, lying in my tent, listening for sounds that didn't come. The next day, I pushed on. I was supposed to stay out for another 3 days, but I'd lost the urge. I wanted out. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The woods felt wrong, like they were closing in. Midway through the day, I found the second sign. Pile of rocks. Small ones, stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. That might not sound like much, but it stopped me cold. I hadn't seen anything like it before. Someone had put it there, recently, and I had the horrible feeling it was meant for me. I kicked the pile over and kept moving, faster now, my legs burning. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the trail behind me was always empty. Then came the third sign, the worst one. I'd been hiking for hours, pushing myself harder than I should have, hoping to make it back to my car by nightfall. But I wasn't making progress. The trail wasn't right. I should have reached a certain ridge by now, but it wasn't there. Felt like I was walking in circles. And then I saw my own boot print, the same print I had left that morning when I first started out. But it was wrong. It was fresh, too fresh, like it had just been made, like someone else had stepped in my exact spot not long ago. I stopped, my breathing too loud in the silence. I wasn't alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew someone was there, watching me, playing with me. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches cutting at my arms, my pack slamming against my back. I ran until my legs burned and my chest ached, until I thought I was going to collapse. Then, just as the sun started to dip below the trees, I saw something through the gaps in the branches. My car. It was there right where I left it. Somehow I had made it back. I didn't stop to think about how. I just ran straight for it, yanking the keys from my pocket with shaking fingers. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I drove for hours, not letting myself feel safe until I was back on paved roads, until the lights of a town appeared in the distance. Only then did I pull over, my hands still gripping the wheel, my whole body shaking. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were watching me. They were following me, and they wanted me to know it. I haven't gone back. I won't. Some places you just aren't meant to be. I remember the drive up the mountain, winding roads cutting through dense forests, the air growing colder with every mile. It was late October, and I had planned this solo hunting trip for months. I needed the quiet, the isolation, just me, my rifle, and the woods. I had been hunting since I was a kid, and I knew the land well, or at least I thought I did. The sun was setting when I pulled my truck into the clearing. The treetops were painted orange and red, but the shadows below were already dark. I set up camp quickly, small fire, tent, rifle within arm's reach. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I was alone, or at least I hoped I was. The first night was uneventful. I woke before dawn, packed my gear, and hiked deeper into the woods. The plan was to track deer near a creek a few miles in. I moved slow, watching for movement, ears tuned to the sounds of the forest. The world around me was still waking up. Birds chirped, a squirrel darted up a tree, a rabbit froze in the brush before vanishing. Normal things. But then I found something that wasn't normal. A boot print, fresh, not mine. It was deep in the mud, meaning whoever left it had some weight on them. I scanned the ground, found another, and another. They led away from the creek, deeper into the forest. There weren't supposed to be other people out here, at least not this far in. No campsites, no trails, just wilderness. I told myself it was a hiker, maybe another hunter. I ignored the way my gut twisted and kept moving. The feeling of being watched started soon after. I'd stop, and the woods would go silent. Too silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. I'd turn, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. The feeling would pass, and the forest would return to normal. It happened again and again throughout the day. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I focused on the hunt. By late afternoon, I had my kill, a decent-sized buck. I gutted it fast, strapped it up, and started heading back. The woods felt different now, heavier. The trees seemed taller, the spaces between them darker. My rifle felt small in my hands, and then I found the second set of tracks. These weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, human. The steps were uneven, like whoever made them was limping. They led in the same direction as mine. Following me, I picked up my pace. The sun was sinking. I needed to get back to camp before dark. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing down on me like a weight. I gripped my rifle tighter, eyes scanning the trees, breath coming faster. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I reached camp just as the last light faded. My fire had been put out. Not burned out, put out. My gear had been moved, my tent unzipped. I stood there, rifle raised, heart pounding. The woods were silent. I forced myself to check my tent. Nothing missing, nothing stolen. Just disturbed. Someone had been here. I built the fire back up, sitting with my rifle across my lap, back to a tree. I wasn't sleeping. I was gonna sit there all night if I had to. The fire crackled, but the darkness beyond it was thick, swallowing everything past a few feet. I listened, waited. Sometime in the early hours, I heard it. Footsteps, not an animal, not a deer or a bear. Person. Slow, deliberate steps moving just outside the fire's reach. I raised my rifle, finger on the trigger, eyes locked on the trees. My breath was loud in my ears. The footsteps stopped, and then something whistled. A low, eerie tune. No words, just a melody. Came from the darkness, moving, circling. My hands were shaking. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The fire flickered. Shadows shifted. The whistling stopped. Silence. Then, just beyond the firelight, something stepped forward. A man, or what used to be a man. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over sharp bones. He had no shoes, his feet black with dirt. His clothes were rags, torn and stained. His face, sunken eyes, lips cracked and dry. He was grinning. I raised my rifle, aimed at his chest. "I'll shoot." My voice cracked. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there staring. Then he turned, slow and stiff, and walked back into the woods, vanishing into the blackness. I didn't sleep, didn't move, just sat there watching, waiting. At dawn, I packed my gear, left the deer behind, and started back to my truck. I moved fast, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods were awake again. Birds chirping, leaves rustling. Felt normal, but I wasn't fooled. When I reached my truck, there were footprints around it. Bare, human footprints circling it over and over again. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I never went hunting there again. I've always been a man of the woods. Spent my whole life hiking, hunting, and camping alone in places where most people wouldn't dare go. The deeper and more untouched the forest, the better. But there was one trip, one single night, that changed the way I look at the wild forever. I still go out there, but I don't go alone anymore. It started in early October, the air crisp but not yet freezing. The best time of year. The leaves had just started to turn, and the forest was alive with color. I had picked a spot deep in the Appalachians, a place I'd never been before but had scouted on a map. No trails, no campsites, just pure, unspoiled wilderness. My plan was simple. Hike in about 15 miles, set up camp, and spend a couple of days just existing out there, away from the world. The first day was perfect. I made good time, following an old game trail that wound through the trees like a barely there scar in the earth. No sign of other people, exactly how I liked it. The deeper I got, the quieter it became. Not just in the way that cities are noisy and forests are not, but a different kind of quiet, like something was holding its breath. By late afternoon, I found a good spot, a small clearing near a creek, just big enough for my one-man tent and a small fire. I set up camp, gathered some wood, and sat back to enjoy the evening. As the sun dipped below the trees, I let the sounds of the forest wash over me. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft gurgle of the creek. Felt right, felt normal. Then, at some point during the night, I woke up. No reason, no nightmare, no sound that startled me. Just suddenly, I was wide awake, staring at the nylon roof of my tent. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't the natural quiet of the deep woods. It was complete, not a single sound. No wind, no leaves rustling, no insects. Just absolute, suffocating stillness. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes silent, something's wrong. Usually it means a predator is near, a bear, a mountain lion, something big enough to make the smaller creatures freeze. I lay there, heart pounding, listening so hard my ears ached. And then, from somewhere far off in the trees, I heard it. A single sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. Not a natural sound. Too deliberate, too heavy. I reached for the knife I always keep beside my sleeping bag and waited. Another crack, closer this time, and then another. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving toward me. Slow, intentional. I sat up as quietly as I could, my fingers tight around the hilt of my knife. My breath felt too loud. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The snapping twigs stopped, replaced by a different sound. Breathing, not mine, not an animal's. Human, ragged and deep, just outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't even blink. My entire body screamed at me to do something, to run, to fight, to make a sound. But I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, as that slow, wet breathing filled the space between me and the thin fabric wall. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence stretched. I could feel something standing there, just inches away. I held my breath, listening. And then, slowly, I reached out and grabbed the zipper of my tent. I yanked it down in one quick motion, my knife raised, and there was nothing there. The forest stretched out in front of me, bathed in the weak glow of my dying fire. The trees stood motionless. The air was still, but the feeling remained, that overwhelming, gut-deep certainty that I was not alone. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, knife in hand, eyes darting between the trees. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear and started back the way I came. I didn't run. Running in the woods gets you hurt. But I moved fast, never stopping, never looking back. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something. The forest wasn't right. The trees looked different. The landscape felt wrong. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, but as the hours passed, I realized something chilling. I wasn't on my original path. I'm not an amateur. I know how to navigate. I use a compass, pay attention to landmarks, make mental notes of my surroundings. And yet, somehow, I was lost. I took out my map, rechecked my compass. Both told me I was going the right way, but the ground beneath my feet said otherwise. Then I saw it. A tree just ahead of me, with something hanging from a low branch. Piece of fabric. Red. I moved closer, my stomach twisting. It was a scrap of my own bandana, the one I had tied around my pack the day before. I had just walked in a circle. Something cold settled in my chest. I wasn't just lost. I was being led. I don't remember the rest of that day in detail. Just fear, panic, moving faster, getting nowhere. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. I forced myself to stop, to think. I needed a plan. Running blindly wasn't working. That's when I heard it again. That slow, deliberate cracking of branches. Only this time, it wasn't coming toward me. It was circling. It stayed just out of sight, just out of reach. The same slow, patient movements as the night before. I gritted my teeth, refusing to panic. Whatever this was, it wanted me scared, wanted me running. So I didn't. I forced myself to think, to remember the land. I knew there was a river nearby. If I could reach it, I could follow it out. Water always leads somewhere. I turned sharply, heading west. The sound followed, but now it was moving faster. The cracking branches turned into something else, something deliberate. Footsteps. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran. Branches tore at my arms and face. My pack felt like dead weight, but I ran. I ran until I heard it, the rush of water. I burst from the trees onto the rocky shore of a wide, fast-moving river. And then, for the first time, I turned around. Nothing. Just the trees, the silence. But I knew something was there, watching, waiting. I didn't stop. I followed the river, moving as fast as my legs could carry me. I walked all night. By dawn, I found a road. By noon, I was back in my truck. I never figured out what was out there. Maybe it was some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe something worse. But I know one thing: I was never supposed to leave. I spent my whole life hiking. I know how to read maps, how to move without a trail, how to keep my bearings no matter how dense the trees get. But none of that mattered when I got lost in those woods. It was a late fall trip. I planned a solo hike into a stretch of forest that wasn't too far from home but was isolated enough that I wouldn't run into anyone else. I wanted that peace, the feeling of nothing but trees and wind and my own breath. I packed light but smart, enough food for a few days, a sturdy tent, extra layers, and a satellite GPS just in case. That thing was my lifeline. At least that's what I thought. The first day was easy. The air was cold but dry, and the forest floor was thick with fallen leaves. I found a good spot to set up camp by a creek and built a small fire as the sun dipped low. I ate my dinner staring at the sky, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Felt good to be out there. It always did. The second day, I pushed deeper. No trails, no markers, just me and the land. I made a note of landmarks. A fallen birch with a twisted trunk. A boulder split down the middle like an axe had cleaved it. I wasn't worried. I had my GPS, and even if that failed, I knew how to navigate. Around midday, I checked my GPS just to confirm my direction. The screen showed an error message. I frowned, turned it off, turned it back on. Nothing, just a blank screen. I tapped at it, shook it, held the power button down. Still nothing. It was dead. I told myself it wasn't a problem. I could find my way back. I had my compass. I had my sense of direction. But an unease settled in my gut. The GPS shouldn't have died. It was fully charged when I left. I turned back the way I'd come, or at least I thought I did. The forest didn't look right. The landmarks I had noted weren't there. I walked farther, expecting to see the fallen birch, the split boulder. But they never appeared. I kept moving, kept looking. Hours passed. The sun was dipping again, and my breath was coming short. I forced myself to stop. I needed to set up camp. Panicking wouldn't help. I could figure it out in the morning. That night, the forest felt different. The wind had died down, and the silence was heavy, pressing in on me. I barely slept. Every little sound made my skin crawl. Branches shifting, leaves crunching, the distant snap of something moving in the underbrush. Probably just deer. Probably. At dawn, I packed up and started walking again. I picked a direction and stuck to it. I walked for hours, but the forest never changed. The trees all looked the same, tall, bare, endless. I wasn't seeing any streams, any clearings, just trees. And then I saw it, the split boulder. But it was wrong. It was the same one, I was sure of it, but I had walked straight away from it for hours. There was no way I should have ended up here again. My stomach turned cold. I pushed forward, ignoring the dread creeping up my spine. I walked for hours. I forced myself not to think about how the trees seemed to stretch on forever, how nothing around me changed, how the sun moved across the sky, but I never seemed to get anywhere. I made camp again that night, but I didn't sleep. My fire felt too small, too weak against the blackness of the trees. I kept hearing things, footsteps just beyond the light, twigs breaking, leaves shifting. I told myself it was animals, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I walked faster. I moved with purpose, refusing to stop, refusing to let the panic take over. But no matter how far I went, I kept finding things I had already passed. A stump with a jagged scar. A patch of ferns crushed underfoot. The split boulder. Again, I screamed. I grabbed a rock and threw it as hard as I could. It hit a tree and bounced off, landing in the leaves with a dull thud. My breath came fast. I felt like I was suffocating. The forest was swallowing me whole. By the 5th day, my food was running low. I had been rationing, but I hadn't expected to be out this long. My water filter was still good, but hunger was setting in hard. My body was getting sluggish. My mind was slipping. I stopped checking my GPS. I knew it wouldn't work. I stopped looking at my map. It was useless. I just kept walking, hoping I'd break out of whatever was keeping me trapped here. Then I found my first camp. My fire pit burned down to ash. The spot where I had slept. My own footprints circling the site. I had been walking in circles for days. That was the moment I almost gave up. I slumped down onto the cold ground, head in my hands. I was exhausted. My body ached. My stomach was tight with hunger. I didn't know what to do anymore. But then, something inside me snapped. I forced myself to think, to focus. If I was walking in circles, then I needed to change something. I needed to stop moving blindly. I climbed a tree, took everything I had left, but I made it up high enough to see. And what I saw nearly broke me. Endless trees, no roads, no clearings, just a solid, unbroken sea of forest in every direction. But then there, a thin, dark line cutting through the trees. A river. It wasn't close, but it was real. It was something. I climbed down, legs shaking, and started toward it. Took another full day, but I reached it. Cold, rushing water. I drank deep, feeling it burn down my throat. I knew rivers led somewhere. I just had to follow it. I walked along the bank for hours, then days. I ate what little I could find, berries, stripped bark, anything. But I kept moving. I kept going. On the 7th day, I saw it. A road. A real, solid, man-made road. I stumbled toward it, barely believing it was real. And then headlights. A truck. A real, actual truck. I staggered into the road, waving my arms, and the driver slammed the brakes. I must have looked insane. Dirty, starved, wild-eyed. But he rolled down the window, mouth open in shock. I didn't even have the strength to speak. I just nodded, shaking, as he asked if I was okay. And for the first time in days, I knew I would be. I had always been comfortable in the woods, grew up around them, hunted in them, camped more times than I could count. The forest was my second home, a place I understood better than any city or town. But there are places in the world that remind you just how small you really are, and I found one of those places deep in the Cascade Mountains. I was on a solo backpacking trip, something I did a few times a year. I liked the solitude, the silence, cleared my head in a way nothing else could. This time I had planned for a 3-day trek, off-trail, into a part of the mountains I hadn't explored before. I had pored over the topographical maps, noted the elevation changes, the creeks, the ridges. Everything checked out. It was supposed to be challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. The first day was fine. Hard hiking, but nothing out of the ordinary. I set up camp in a small clearing, filtered water from a nearby stream, and settled in for the night. I had my bare canister, my food stored away properly. Nothing to worry about. The forest was quiet except for the usual sounds. The occasional snap of a branch, distant hoots of an owl, the wind moving through the trees. The second day, things started feeling off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things that gnawed at the back of my mind. I'd find game trails that seemed unusually well-trodden, like something big had been moving through them more often than normal. I found a deer carcass, picked clean, but it didn't look like the usual predator kill. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks. Just there, in the middle of a clearing, bones stripped bare. By midday, I reached a valley that was supposed to have a small creek running through it, according to the map. The creek was dry, not just low, but completely dry, as if it hadn't seen water in years. That was strange. The snowmelt should have been feeding it this time of year. The ground wasn't cracked like a typical dried-up creek bed, either. It just looked wrong, almost like something had sucked the moisture out of it overnight. I kept moving. The unease grew. The woods felt too quiet. I kept catching movements out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been out in the wild enough to know how easy it was to spook yourself, especially alone. But then I found the footprints. They were human, barefoot, and deep. Whoever had made them was heavy, and they weren't old. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed. I crouched down, running my fingers along the indentations. The person had been running. I could tell by the way the toe prints dug in harder than the heel. They were fresh, less than a few hours old. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. No sounds, no movement. Just the trees standing silent and watchful. I followed the prints for a while, but they led in a meandering pattern, almost as if the person had been running in circles. And then, just like that, they stopped. No more prints. No sign of where the person had gone. That was when I decided to turn back. I had plenty of daylight left, but my gut told me to leave. I backtracked carefully, making sure to follow my own markers. My pack felt heavier than before, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on me. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a faint rustle, a branch snapping, but every time I stopped to listen, it was gone. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I had made a mistake. I had miscalculated my route back. Somehow, I had veered off course even though I had been so careful. My markers were gone. I should have reached the ridgeline by now, but instead, I was in another dense stretch of forest that I didn't recognize. Panic started creeping in, but I pushed it down. I had a GPS, a map, a compass. I wasn't lost. Not really. I just needed to get my bearings. I decided to make camp and reset in the morning. That night was the worst of my life. It started with the sounds. At first, it was subtle twigs snapping, something brushing against the undergrowth. Normal forest noises. But then it changed. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too steady. I held my breath, gripping my knife. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows against the trees. Then, just outside the ring of light, I saw it. A figure, standing still, watching. I couldn't see details, just the outline of a person. They didn't move. They just stood there. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, but eventually, I grabbed my headlamp and flicked it on. The second the light hit the spot, the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, I packed up in minutes and started moving. Ivalkiet fast. I didn't stop for breaks. I needed to get out. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every few minutes, I'd glance back, and every time, I swore I saw movement just behind the trees. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A campsite, an old one. A tent, torn open, mold creeping up its sides. A sleeping bag, half buried in dirt. And a backpack, unzipped, its contents spilled out as if someone had gone through it in a hurry. I forced myself to look inside. Clothes, faded and rotting. A journal, its pages too weathered to read. And then, in the side pocket, a wallet. I opened it with shaking hands. The ID inside was mine. My face, my name, my address. But the card was old, the plastic warped, the photo faded like it had been sitting out here for years. I dropped it and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw the ridgeline. And then, hours later, I found my car. I never went back. I don't talk about it. But sometimes I dream about that campsite, about the footprints that led nowhere, and about the figure watching from the trees, waiting.